Potatoes. These are incredible, they're cheap, they're versatile. Today's episode, we're making 3 different kinds of mashed potatoes. Let's go. Mashed potatoes are such a great thing to know how to make. It turns out there's actually a bunch of different ways that you can make mashed potatoes. There's the fluffy North American style mashed potato. This is what I grew up with. They're delicious and they're really, really easy to make. You can make a super fancy version, a French-inspired, a Michelin star chef-approved recipe. We're gonna make some Pomme Puree. And then last but not least, we're gonna mix together potatoes and a bunch of cheese. We're making not 1, not 2, but 3 different kinds of mashed potatoes. Let's get started with our first recipe, the fluffy mashed potato. So our first potato recipe is the most traditional type of mashed potato, at least for me. This is what I grew up eating. Starts with, you guessed it, potatoes. I'm gonna peel these, make sure most of the peel's off, even if there's a little bit left, that's fine. And we're gonna cut these down into chunks, about 1 inch thick. It really doesn't matter how large you cut these, you just want them to all be the same size. About this size looks pretty good. Move to our stove, got a pot. You don't need anything really too big. Put the potatoes in, cover with cold water, and then bring that cold water up to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, we're gonna lower the heat and let these simmer for about 15 to 20 minutes. While those are simmering, we can prepare our liquids. We need whole milk and some butter. Actually, a fairly large amount of butter. Wait till you see how much butter is in recipe number 2. A little bit of salt, and then we're gonna melt all of this because we want it to be hot when it goes into the potato mixture. Just make sure it keeps moving so nothing scorches on the bottom of the pot. Now I'm gonna check my potatoes to see if they're done. You want the knife to go in with very, very little resistance. Drain off the potatoes. The water can just go down the drain, and then we're gonna put this back over the heat and leave it over the heat for about 1 minute or so, lightly stirring everything. This is gonna help some of the water evaporate. After that minute, put the potatoes into a bowl, and then I'm just gonna use a fork to mash these. You could use a potato masher if you want, but I sort of want these to be a little chunky. Add our mixture of milk, butter, and salt, and then just keep mashing with the fork. And then we'll season these with a bit of pepper, a bit of salt. I've got some chives here. Mix everything together, and we're ready to throw this on a plate, and we have our first mashed potato. Here, this is the fluffy version. It's really holding its shape really well. Putting a bunch of gravy around this would be awesome, but most importantly, let's give them a try. Super delicious. They're fluffy, they're still light, even though there's a lot of butter and milk and those types of things in there. I think these look really, really good. Perfect fluffy mashed potato. Recipe number 1 was a pretty big success. Stick around in this video. I've got 2 more incredible mashed potatoes, including one that has so much cheese, you've got to see it to believe it. So let's say you went to a Michelin star restaurant. Would you get mashed potatoes? Absolutely, you'd get mashed potatoes, but they'd be called something else. Probably get what's called Pomme Puree. Basically just French for mashed potatoes, pureed potatoes. They're also called Robichon potatoes, which is from super famous chef Joby Robichon. Passed away a couple years ago, but his potato legacy endured. He has the recipe for perfect Pomme Puree, and they're a fair bit different than the mashed potatoes that we just made. Better? Well, that's really up to you, but they're different. They're smoother, looser, I guess you would probably say. A few little chefy tips and tricks, we can really amp up the potato flavor. Let's make Robichon potatoes or Pomme Puree. This is a French recipe, as I'm sure you can tell by the words on the screen. We're gonna use fingerling potatoes this time. These are the most similar to the potatoes that they would use in France for this recipe. And most importantly, we can cook these potatoes whole. The idea here is if we can avoid introducing too much water into the dish, we can intensify the potato flavor. So once these come to a boil, lower our heat, and we are going to slightly simmer them for about 15 to 20 minutes. After about 15 minutes and you think they're done, same thing as before, check them with a knife, and then we can just pull the potatoes right out of the water and put them on a cutting board. Obviously, we need to get rid of the skins. We don't want those in our mashed potatoes. We're just gonna pull them off with our hands. If, like me, you still have nerve endings in your hands, I feel like Michelin-starred chefs probably don't, you can use a towel and just peel these off. It's a little bit cumbersome doing this, but it's going to help by ensuring not a lot of water gets into the potatoes. Once all the peels are off, we'll get rid of the peels, throw them in the garbage, and then we're gonna use a food mill or a ricer. I have a food mill to puree these as opposed to using the fork. This is gonna give us a much more delicate potato at the end of the day. Just turn the food mill, pass them through, and then we're putting a ridiculous amount of butter into these. You can see how much is here. I'm just gonna add this in stages, mixing the potatoes and mixing the butter. The potatoes are still warm, so the butter should melt when it's added to the hot potato, but they're gonna look not completely done at this point. What we're gonna do is we're gonna move back to our stove, heat up some milk, and then add the potatoes into the milk. They're gonna look really loose at first, but if you keep them over heat for about 2 to 3 minutes, stirring constantly, they will thicken up. The last thing that we're gonna do is pass them through a sieve. This is optional, but we really wanna make sure these are as smooth and as delicate as possible. Just using a rubber spatula or a plastic bench scraper, push them through the fine mesh sieve, scrape off the other end, and then put them on a plate, and now we have Michelin-starred Pomme Puree. All right, we've got our second mashed potato, or Pomme Puree. It's a lot looser, certainly not fluffy like the first one. It's really, really good. There's no wonder that this is at Michelin-starred restaurants and this is what they serve. It's really smooth and creamy and buttery. There is almost equal parts of butter to potato in this one. It's outstanding, but it still tastes really potato-y. I think cooking with the skins on made a really, really big difference. It's really amplifying that potato taste. Outstanding mashed potatoes. So we figured out what would happen if you went to a Michelin-star restaurant and wanted some mashed potato. What would happen if we added a little bit of cheese to this potato? What would happen if we added an unbelievable amount of cheese to the potatoes? We get what's known as Aligot. These are incredible. One of my favorite ways to make mashed potatoes. Let's make some Aligot. We're going back to the potato that we used in recipe number 1, just sort of the traditional grocery store potato. I'm going to peel these. Again, we're not going to cook these whole. We're going to peel them and cut them into chunks, basically the exact same way that we did in our first recipe. Again, the key with this is cutting them down into similar size pieces. This looks pretty good. Set up my stove and put my potatoes and cover them, again, with cold water. We're going to bring this up to a boil and then reduce the heat and cook them for about the 15 to 20 minutes that we've done on every other potato. While we're doing that, we've got some Gruyere cheese. Lots of different types of cheeses that you can use. Cheeses like Comté, Fontina. I think Gruyere is the best, but use whatever you like. So I'm gonna cut this down. I only need about half of this. Just weigh it out and then grate it on the large holes of a box grater. This is gonna help it melt evenly. You don't want to just put the cheese in whole. You'll see why in a second. This looks pretty good here, so we can move on to our next step. The second thing that we need to do is prepare some whipped cream. A little bit different than our previous recipes. It's gonna be a little bit richer with the whipped cream, but like before, we need to heat this up. Just bring it up to a slight simmer and then set it aside. Our potatoes, we can check these like we've done before. Little resistance from the knife so we can drain them and move them back over the stove and try and evaporate a little bit of the water like we've done on the previous recipes. Once the water has been gone for about a minute or two, we're going to use our food mill again this time because we're going to get that really nice sort of creamy texture. Pass them through the food mill, scrape off the end, and then we're going to add in some butter. I mean, this is a French recipe. We have to ensure that there's butter in it. Otherwise, well, it probably wouldn't be French. Add half the butter, mix, and then add the second half of the butter. Then we're going to do the same thing with the cream. Add half of it, mix it together, and add the second half. Now we're going to start adding in the cheese. I'm going to take just a small handful and mix it into the still warm potatoes with my rubber spatula. And then once it's started to melt down, I'm going to add another handful. Your potatoes have probably cooled off by this point, so you're going to want to go back over the stove, put them over very low heat, and then continue to add your cheese in handful by handful. The little bit of heat underneath the potatoes is going to help melt the cheese. And you're going to end up with this really stringy, this really gooey mashed potato. Look at that cheese pull. Look how great that looks. Only thing we have left to do is put this on a plate and give it a try. Our third mashed potatoes. This is Aligot. Super cheesy. Look at that. Let's give it a try. Oh, you can really taste the Gruyere. I mean, obviously there's a ton of Gruyere in here. This is a fantastic mashed potato. Awesome. 3 different ways to make mashed potatoes. We did a fluffy mashed potatoes, Pomme Puree, or Ruby-Champ mashed potatoes. It's super cheesy, Aligot. Which one is your favorite? Leave a comment below and let me know. If you have other mashed potato recipes, leave a comment below as well. If you enjoyed this video, smash the like button, subscribe if you want to see more videos, share it with a friend. Aside from that, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.